the glint of steel handcuffs reflected in the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct. "No. You really think you're going to get away with this, Eleanor?" Mark's voice dripped with condescension, his face a smug mask as the officers led me towards the interrogation room. He chuckled, a low, grating sound. "Let's see how the little old lady survives a night in jail. It's just 6 months later." That smug look shattered into disbelief when he saw me, Eleanor Vance, sitting at the head of the city council meeting, the chief of police himself, introducing me. The gavel I held wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a hammer ready to bring down the law on those who thought they were above it. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The cool, sterile air of the precinct felt like a physical blow, stark contrast to the stifling humidity of the summer night outside. My silk dress, chosen for what I thought would be a celebratory dinner, now felt hopelessly out of place, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. My sensible heels, usually a comfort, clicked an unwelcome rhythm against the linoleum floor. I, Eleanor Vance, a woman over 60 with a lifetime of quiet civic duty and community service, was sitting on a hard bench in a police station, accused of a crime I didn't commit and abandoned by the man who had vowed to protect me. My husband, Mark, just hours earlier the evening had been filled with the promise of Mark's latest triumph. He was a real estate developer, always chasing the next big project. Tonight was supposed to be the unveiling of his ambitious new downtown revitalization plan. I, as usual, was by his side, a supportive, smiling presence, ready to engage with the city's movers and shakers. We were at the pre-event reception, a glittering affair in the city's grandest ballroom, when the whispers started. I'd seen Mark speaking intensely with his business partner, a man named Victor, their faces grim, their voices low. Moments later, Mark excused himself, claiming an urgent phone call, and I, ever the understanding wife, simply nodded. Then the commotion began. Uniformed officers, far too many of them, swarmed the ballroom. A senior detective, his face grim, approached me directly. "Mrs. Vance, we have some questions for you regarding alleged financial irregularities in your husband's development projects." My heart hammered against my ribs. Financial irregularities. Mark had always been meticulous, almost obsessively so, with his books. I tried to explain, to defend him, but the words caught in my throat as the detective's gaze hardened. "We believe you may be involved in a scheme to divert public funds, Mrs. Vance." Before I could fully process the accusation, Mark reappeared, his face pale, but his voice surprisingly calm. "Eleanor, darling," he said, his arm going around my waist, a gesture of affection that now felt utterly hollow. "There's been a misunderstanding. Just cooperate. It'll all be cleared up." He smiled, that practiced charming smile that had once captivated me, but his eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. "I'll handle this. You just go with the officers." He gave my arm a squeeze, a fleeting touch that felt more like a push, and then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving me to be escorted out by 2 impassive officers. The drive to the precinct was a blur of flashing lights and hushed conversations. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Mark and I had been married for over 40 years. We'd built a life together, raised a family, contributed to our community. I'd always trusted him implicitly, especially when it came to business. I had often signed documents he placed before me, confident in his judgment, assuming everything was above board. He'd always handled the finances, insisting I focus on my volunteer work in our home. "You have a gift for making our home a sanctuary, Eleanor," he'd always said. "Leave the messy business to me," and I had, completely now. Sitting on this cold bench, the reality of my situation began to sink in. My phone, my purse, everything had been taken for evidence. I had no way to contact anyone. I was 65 years old, effectively stranded and staring down the barrel of a potential criminal investigation. A uniformed officer approached me. "Your husband has checked out, left instructions that you are to be processed, and that he will be in touch with his lawyer in the morning." Checked out? The words echoed in my mind, a cruel twist on what I'd once thought was a loving partnership. He hadn't just left. He had deliberately abandoned me, leaving me to face the music alone. The guard's expression was unreadable, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it pity or contempt? Either way, it stung worse than any accusation. 2 hours earlier, I had overheard a snippet of conversation between Mark and Victor. Mark had been agitated, whispering about missing funds and a paper trail leading straight to the foundation. I hadn't paid much attention at the time, dismissing it as typical business jargon. Now, the words came back to me with chilling clarity. Mark's sudden paleness, his too calm demeanor, his quick departure, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. He wasn't just abandoning me, he was making me the scapegoat. My entire life, I had prided myself on my quiet strength, my unwavering support for Mark's ambitions. I had given up my own modest career as a historical archivist years ago to manage our home and social life, believing I was contributing to our shared success. I had made myself indispensable, or so I thought. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had become the perfect political wife, hosting elegant dinners, attending countless charity events, and charming potential investors with my genuine interest in their stories and my vast knowledge of the city's history. I'd made myself indispensable, except apparently I wasn't. A taxi pulled up outside the precinct, its yellow gleam a painful reminder of the outside world. I had no money, no phone, no way to hail it. My thoughts raced. My son, David, was out of the country on a business trip. My daughter, Sarah, lived in another state. Who could I call? God. Mark controlled all our accounts, all our property. My name wasn't even on most of them, a tax strategy he'd insisted on years ago that I'd never questioned. But as panic threatened to overwhelm me, an odd calm settled. For the first time since being brought here, my mind, once trained to meticulously catalog historical facts and discern patterns in ancient documents, began to work with an unnerving clarity. I remembered something, detail from years ago, something Mark might have overlooked in his arrogance. Before our marriage, when he was just starting out, I'd helped him set up the initial paperwork for his first development company. As a gesture, my own father, a shrewd lawyer, had insisted my name be included on some of the founding documents as a silent partner. A way to ensure my future if anything ever went wrong. Mark had dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. Has no place in business, Eleanor, he'd said. But the paperwork had been filed anyway. If those documents still stood, no one had changed them in the intervening decades when I'd stepped back from any official role, a plan, intricate and almost unbelievably audacious, began to form. I'd need allies, resources, and time. Most of all, I'd need Mark to believe he'd won. He's become complacent while I worked in silence. Ma'am, do you need to make a phone call? The officer's voice startled me from my reverie. I looked at him, my gaze steady. Yes, I said, my voice clearer than I expected. I'd need to call a friend who works at City Hall. I believe there's been a grave misunderstanding, and I intend to correct it. As the officer led me to a phone, I caught my reflection in the glass of the door, tear-streaked, disheveled, but with something new in my eyes. The supportive, compliant wife had vanished, abandoned on that cold police station bench. In her place was someone Mark wouldn't recognize when they eventually met again. Someone who remembered every civic connection made, every casual conversation about city politics overheard, every weakness revealed during a lifetime of intimacy. Someone who knew exactly where to look and who to call. Someone dangerous. I was going to take everything from him, but first, I needed to survive. Mark hadn't always been cruel. That was the thought that kept circling in my mind as I sat in the sterile waiting area of the precinct, clutching a flimsy paper cup of water provided by a surprisingly kind desk sergeant. 40 years earlier, Mark Vance had been the rising star of the city's real estate scene, brilliant, ambitious, and surprisingly charming in private. We'd met at a community fundraising gala where I was volunteering, arranging historical exhibits. It challenged one of my assertions about urban planning, and instead of dismissing me, he'd invited me to continue the debate over coffee. You're the sharpest person I've met in ages, Eleanor, he'd said, his eyes alight with genuine admiration, including me. Our courtship moved quickly. Intellectual sparring that turned to respect that ignited into passion. At 24, I had been making my modest mark as a historical archivist, particularly in identifying overlooked land deeds and forgotten property lines. My colleagues had warned me about giving up my career trajectory when Mark proposed just 8 months after we'd met. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor." My dear friend Margaret, a formidable lawyer, had cautioned. I've seen too many brilliant women disappear into their husbands' shadows. But Mark had promised it would be different for us. "We'll be partners in everything," he'd insisted, showing me his ambitious plans for his first development. "Your meticulous research skills, my vision will build something extraordinary together." For the first few years, that promise held. I helped him research zoning laws, pore over historical maps to unearth hidden easements, and even assisted in writing compelling proposals for early projects. Mark's father, a respected local businessman, had provided the seed, funding and connections from his decades in the textile industry. The old man had taken an immediate liking to me. "You remind me of my late wife," he'd confided during our engagement party. "Sharp as a tack and not afraid to speak her mind. Mark needs that." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The change came gradually, subtly. After Mark's father's unexpected death 15 years into our marriage, as Mark's development company expanded, he began excluding me from meetings, citing complex legal jargon I wouldn't understand. My role shifted from strategic partner to civic leader's wife, planning events, maintaining our growing social network, and creating the perfect home environment where Mark could focus on scaling the business. The elegant brownstone we lived in, located in the city's historic district, had been our first major extravagance. I had thrown myself into decorating it, telling myself this was still contributing to our shared vision. "The Midtown Plaza deal hinged on that dinner you hosted, Eleanor," Mark would say, validating my new role. "You have a gift for making people comfortable enough to sign on the dotted line." I'd accepted these crumbs of acknowledgement, ignoring how he increasingly controlled our finances, removing my access to company information to protect me from liability concerns. I'd surrendered my financial independence so gradually I hardly noticed its disappearance. The gala tonight was supposed to be a celebration of Mark Vance's dominance in the city's real estate market. 40 years of building had made him wealthy and respected. His company now employed hundreds, with projects across multiple states. I'd been excited to attend, spending weeks researching the historical significance of the ballroom, preparing anecdotes to share with the city's historical society members who would be present. Mark had even seemed pleased by my preparation, reviewing my notes on the drive over. "This is why you're invaluable," he'd said, squeezing my hand as our limousine approached the brightly lit venue. "You think of everything, except the possibility that my husband was using his legitimate business as cover for illegal activities. Everything except that he might abandon me at the first sign of trouble." "Mrs. Vance?" The booking officer's voice pulled me from my memories. "We've located your emergency contact information in our system. Would you like us to contact your friend, Margaret Evans? She's listed as your primary." Margaret, my steadfast friend, the lawyer who had never quite trusted Mark, who had maintained our close relationship despite his subtle attempts to isolate me from my old network, the friend who had insisted I put her name down with the precinct just in case, before this gala, a joke we'd shared about Mark's unpredictable temper. "Yes," I whispered, relief flooding through me. "Please contact her immediately." While the officers worked on my official processing, I used their phone to call Margaret directly. "He did what?" My friend's outrage burned through the line. "That absolute monster. I'm coming down there right now." "No," I said firmly, my voice gaining strength. "I need you back in your office, Margaret, not here." "Eleanor, you're in a police station. Need help." "I do need help," I corrected her, lowering my voice, conscious of others nearby, "but not the kind you think. I need you to go to the old office. Remember the file boxes I kept from when I helped Mark start the company? Don't tell anyone what you're doing, not even your colleagues." "What are you planning?" Margaret's voice had changed, recognizing something in my tone. "Justice," I answered simply. I'll need every document from the original incorporation. Mark made a mistake tonight, but it wasn't abandoning me. It was reminding me who I used to be. Mark Maisto E. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the window. My elegant dress now looked rumpled and out of place, but my eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen in years. The supportive, quiet wife was gone. The meticulous archivist who specialized in identifying vulnerabilities had returned. The booking officer approached with forms for my temporary release. "We can arrange a taxi for you, Mrs. Vance. You'll just need to sign here, acknowledging your cooperation." I took the pen, hesitating only briefly before signing. Not as Eleanor Vance, but as Eleanor Reeves Vance, my full legal name. That included my maiden name, the name that appeared on Mark's original company documents. The name Mark had spent years training me to forget. The first hint that something was wrong with Mark's company came 6 months before tonight's disaster at the city's annual charity auction. I had orchestrated the event, as always, a sophisticated affair at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with carefully curated guests and impeccable details designed to impress potential clients and reward loyal ones. Mark had been unusually tense. In the weeks leading up to the event, disappearing into his home office for late-night calls he claimed were with international investors. Once, I'd caught him hurriedly closing spreadsheets that looked nothing like the company's usual financial documents, just exploring some alternative investment structures, he'd explained, kissing my forehead dismissively. "Nothing you need to worry about." At the auction, I was making my usual rounds when I overheard Victor, Mark's head of acquisitions, in a heated whisper with Leonard, the company's legal counsel. "The Plaza deal has to go perfectly," Victor muttered. "The mayor's office is getting nervous about the campaign contributions." "Keep your voice down," Leonard hissed, eyes darting around the room before landing on me. His expression shifted instantly to an artificial smile. "Eleanor, magnificent event as always." When I mentioned the exchange to Mark later that night, his reaction was disproportionate. A flash of anger, quickly masked by forced casualness. "You misheard," he insisted, loosening his tie with deliberate calm. "And you shouldn't eavesdrop on business conversations you don't understand." "I understand municipal funding regulations quite well," I reminded him, feeling a flicker of my old professional pride. "If the company is using campaign contributions for leverage, I could help ensure everything's structured properly." Mark's laugh held an edge I'd never heard before. "Stick to planning parties, Eleanor. It's what you're good at now." That night marked the first time I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. As Mark slept beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling, remembering the meticulous archivist I'd once been. The woman who had specialized in identifying suspicious patterns in historical land transactions. The warning signs continued accumulating. Mark began traveling more frequently, often with little notice. Our joint credit card statements showed large cash withdrawals in various international locations. When I questioned a $15,000 withdrawal in the Cayman Islands, Mark created a new credit card account that I couldn't access. "It simplifies the company reimbursements," he explained. The accountant suggested it. I found myself increasingly isolated. Mark discouraged my lunches with former colleagues, claiming they only wanted inside information about his projects. He suggested my friend Margaret was jealous of our success when I planned visits with her. Even our social circle narrowed to only those couples directly beneficial to Mark's business. One evening, while searching for a missing document, in Mark's old desk, I found a burner phone I didn't recognize. It was locked, but a series of cryptic messages flashed across the screen. "Mayor's office cleared payment. Offshore account transfer confirmed. Victor needs another ghost company set up by next week." When confronted, Mark claimed it was for a top-secret city contract that required operational security. "This is classified, Eleanor," he said sharply. "Shouldn't have even told you that much. Don't mention it again." I didn't, but I did begin paying closer attention. The Mark I'd married, brilliant but ethical, ambitious but principled, seemed to be disappearing behind a facade I couldn't penetrate. The man who had once valued my intelligence now seemed threatened by it. 2 months before the gala, received a strange call from Mark's father's old friend, a retired city planner named Robert Davies. "I've been trying to reach you privately for weeks," he said, his voice tense. "Something's not right with the city contracts Mark's been getting. I'm still connected to some old databases. There are patterns that don't make sense. Large sums moving through multiple shell companies within hours. It has all the markers of public fund embezzlement." I finished automatically, my archivist's mind immediately recognizing what he was describing. "Precisely," he confirmed. "I've tried discussing it with Mark, but he shut me out completely, claimed I'm becoming senile." Robert's voice cracked with indignation. His father would never have permitted this. He built that company on integrity. After the call, I sat in our empty brownstone, looking out at the city's skyline. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the possibility that my husband was involved in something illegal. The thought was physically painful, like acknowledging a fatal diagnosis. Instead of confronting Mark directly, I began subtle research. I renewed connections with former colleagues under the guise of social catch-ups. I paid more attention to the local news about development projects where Mark operated. I noticed patterns myself. Contracts with companies that seemed to exist only on paper. Partnerships with businesses owned by individuals with questionable reputations. When Mark announced I would be joining him for the gala, I was surprised but cautiously hopeful. Perhaps he wanted to reconnect, to rebuild the partnership we'd once had. I prepared meticulously, telling myself this could be an opportunity to understand what was really happening with the company. "I'm looking forward to being more involved again," I told him as we dressed for the event, like the early days. Something flickered across his face. Was it guilt? Fear? But his smile returned quickly. "Of course," he said smoothly. "This is an important night for my future. Our future." I realize now he never intended for me to come home from that gala. The invitation wasn't an olive branch. It was a calculated risk, bringing me into a public setting where, if anything went wrong, I would be isolated, a perfect place to dispose of a liability. I just never expected that liability would be me. The evening of my discovery began ordinarily enough. Mark had left our suite early for what he called a preliminary meeting with city officials. I'd taken advantage of the quiet to catch up on emails and organize my notes for the evening's dinner, where I was expected to charm the wives of city council members and potential investors. Our suite at the Grand Hotel was opulent, to the point of absurdity, a sprawling space with antique furnishings, a private terrace, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city's impossible skyline. The extravagance no longer impressed me as it once had. These days, luxury felt less like an achievement and more like a gilded cage. I'd settled at the mahogany desk overlooking the bustling city streets, reaching for my tablet to review my research on municipal history. 2 identical tablets sat side by side, mine and Mark's. Without thinking, I grabbed the one on the left and opened it. The screen lit up without requesting a password, which should have been my first clue something was wrong. Mark was obsessive. About security, unnecessary paranoia in his line of work, he always claimed. I realized my mistake immediately. I was about to close it when a notification popped up. Transfer to Shell Corporation Phoenix Holdings complete. $5 million. My fingers froze above the keyboard. The amount was staggering, but it was the corporation's name that truly chilled me. Phoenix Holdings. Recognized the pattern from my years of archival research. It stood for a network of shell companies I'd once helped identify in a local corruption investigation during my early career. Instead of closing the tablet, I clicked the notification. Spreadsheet opened, displaying a complex web of transfers, flowing through at least 7 different fictitious companies. The pattern was unmistakable to someone with my background. Large sums being broken down into smaller transfers, moved through multiple jurisdictions, consolidated again, and ultimately emerging as seemingly legitimate campaign contributions or project funding. Classic money laundering, executed with sophisticated precision. My hands trembled as I scrolled further, uncovering details that painted a devastating picture. Mark Vance's legitimate development contracts with the city served as perfect covers for moving illicit funds, some client names I recognized from news reports about corruption investigations. Others were known fronts for criminal organizations. This wasn't a minor ethical lapse or tax avoidance scheme. This was organized crime on a local, systemic scale. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark's voice from the doorway sent ice through my veins. I hadn't heard him return. When I looked up, the husband I thought I knew was unrecognizable. His handsome face was contorted with cold fury, body rigid with contained violence. "Mark, what is this?" I gestured at the screen, still hoping against hope for an explanation that would make sense, that would restore the man I'd married. "These transfers." "Shut the tablet now." His voice was deadly quiet. When I didn't move fast enough, he crossed the room in 3 strides and slammed the tablet shut, nearly catching my fingers. "You have no idea what you've done. What I've done." Belief gave me courage. "What about what you've done? This is embezzlement, Mark, on a massive scale." Grabbed my wrist, fingers digging in painfully. "This isn't your concern. It never was. You gave up the right to question my business decisions when you decided you'd rather be a civic wife than a real partner. That wasn't my decision. You pushed me out because you couldn't handle what building a real empire requires." His voice rose. Then he caught himself, releasing my wrist and stepping back. With visible effort, he composed himself, straightening his bespoke suit jacket. "It doesn't matter now," he said, voice eerily calm as he pulled out his phone. "You've complicated things, but it's manageable." I watched in stunned silence as he sent a text. Within minutes, Victor and Leonard arrived at our suite, faces grim. Mark ushered them into the adjoining sitting room, closing the door. For a whispered conference that left me sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing my bruised wrist and trying to process the collapse of everything I'd believed about my life. When they emerged, all 3 men wore neutral expressions. Mark approached with the smile I'd once found charming. Now it seemed like the grin of a predator. "There's been a change of plans," he said smoothly. "The team needs to handle some regulatory concerns. We'll be moving to another hotel while we sort it out." He handed me my purse. "Bring only what you need for a meeting. We'll come back for the rest." Relief washed over me. It wasn't going to hurt me, just damage control. Still dazed, I followed them to the elevator, surrounded by Mark and his partners. Nobody spoke during the descent. I focused on breathing, on planning what to say, to make Mark understand the danger he was in. Surely we could fix this together. Find a legal exit strategy. The elevator opened directly into the hotel's opulent lobby. Mark guided me toward the front desk with his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that once felt protective, but now seemed controlling. "Mrs. Vance won't be continuing her stay with us," he informed the concierge with practiced charm. "Urgent family matter back home." The concierge looked to me for confirmation. For a moment I considered screaming, causing a scene. But what would I say? That my husband was involved in financial crimes in a city where I had no support system, where Mark's company had powerful connections? I nodded mutely. "Such a shame to cut your trip short," the concierge said sympathetically. That's when Mark leaned close, his lips brushing my ear in what would look like an affectionate gesture to observers. "If you say one word about what you saw, I'll make sure you disappear. Nobody would ever find you." He pressed something into my palm. Single $20 bill. "Consider this generous, given the circumstances." His voice dropped lower, vicious. "Now let's see how the little civic wife survives." Before I could respond, 2 police officers appeared beside us. Victor must have arranged it while Mark distracted me. "This woman is no longer a guest," Mark informed them coldly. "Please escort her out. She's not to return to the property." And the last thing I saw as the officers led me toward the door was Mark and his partners walking briskly toward another exit, Leonard carrying my purse, which had been in my hand just moments before. The hotel doors sealed shut behind me with pneumatic efficiency, cutting off the artificial cool of the lobby and throwing me into the city's merciless afternoon heat. Just like that, I was alone, stranded in my own city, with nothing but $20 and the clothes on my back. 40 years of marriage had ended in less than 10 minutes. The city's merciless afternoon heat pressed against me like a physical weight as I stood frozen outside the opulent hotel. Sweat beaded along my hairline, trickling down my neck and soaking into the silk dress I'd carefully selected that morning a lifetime ago when I was still Eleanor Vance. Respected wife of a successful real estate mogul. Now I was what? Abandoned. Stranded. A woman with no identification, no access to funds, and no way home. For several minutes, I simply couldn't move. Shock had rendered my thoughts sluggish, my body numb. Tourists streamed around me, casting curious glances. At the well-dressed woman standing motionless in the blistering sun, a concerned bellhop approached, asking if I needed assistance. When I didn't respond, he frowned and returned to his post, clearly deciding I wasn't his problem. He was. Right, I was no one's problem but my own. $20 bill burned in my palm, Mark's final insult. A pittance that wouldn't cover half a night in even the cheapest motel. A sum that said clearly, "You are worth nothing to me." Eventually, basic survival instincts broke through my paralysis. I needed shade, water, and a plan. Clutching my meager funds, I walked toward a line of taxis idling in the circular drive, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Each step felt like a personal victory against the crushing weight of betrayal. "City Hall," I told the first driver, my voice sounding distant and unfamiliar to my own ears. As the taxi pulled away, I caught a final glimpse of the Grand Hotel in the side mirror. A monument to wealth and privilege that had briefly been mine but had never truly belonged to me. Much like my marriage, it had been an illusion of security built on unstable foundations. The taxi driver attempted conversation, but I couldn't focus on his words, and my mind replayed the moment of discovery in an endless loop the spreadsheet. Mark's face transforming from the husband I thought I knew into a stranger, the cold calculation in his eyes as he abandoned me. I found myself obsessively cataloging the contents of my purse before it had been taken. Wallet with all my credit cards, smartphone, even my prescription reading glasses. Mark had left me nothing except the $20. No, not nothing. He'd left me with knowledge, dangerous knowledge. City Hall was a majestic old building surrounded by bustling activity. Inside, the air conditioning was a shock after the outdoor furnace. I approached the reception desk, struggling to articulate my situation through increasingly ragged breaths. "My husband abandoned me, took my identification. I need help." The words sounded pathetic, melodramatic, the kind of hysterical female scenario Mark would mock. But the City Hall staff, accustomed to a variety of crises, seemed surprisingly understanding. "Please complete this form, Mrs. Vance," a sympathetic officer named Amber said, leading me to a private room with a glass of water. "We'll need to verify your identity before we can issue temporary identification." Identity? The word echoed in my head as I stared at the form. Who was I now? Not the historical archivist with a promising career, not the polished civic. Wife who excelled at making powerful men feel important. Those identities had been stripped away, leaving what? "Do you have anyone we can contact in the United States?" Amber asked gently. "My friend," I whispered, feeling the first genuine relief since this nightmare began. "Margaret Evans. She's a lawyer." While the City Hall staff worked their bureaucratic magic, the shock began morphing into something else. A cold, clarifying anger that settled in my chest. Mark hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd betrayed everything I thought we stood for, the company we'd built together. Was a criminal enterprise. The wealth we'd accumulated was tainted. The life I'd lived was a carefully constructed lie. When the phone was offered, I called Margaret directly, her familiar voice unleashing the tears I'd been holding back. "He did what?" Her outrage burned through the line. "That absolute monster. I'm coming down there right now." "No," I said, suddenly certain. "I'll need you in your office, Margaret, not here." "Eleanor, you're stranded. You need help." "I do need help, but not the kind you think." I lowered my voice. "I need you to go to the old office. Remember the file boxes I kept from when I helped Mark start the company? Don't tell anyone what you're doing, not even your husband." "What are you planning?" Margaret asked, hearing something new in my voice. "Justice," I answered simply. After arranging for temporary identification, faced my next challenge: accommodation for the night. The City Hall provided a list of modestly priced shelters, but even these would quickly exhaust my $20. I needed more resources. In the City Hall restroom, I assessed my assets. My wedding ring, a modest sapphire in a gold setting, caught the fluorescent light. Mark had replaced my original simple band with this more elaborate stone on our 25th anniversary, calling it an upgrade. I'd worn it proudly, seeing it as a symbol of our enduring success. Now, I recognized it for what it truly was, a gilded shackle, marking me as property. I twisted it off my finger, feeling lighter with its absence. This would be my emergency fund, enough to secure lodging and food until I could arrange passage home. My grandmother's antique locket, a cherished heirloom I always wore, contained a small diamond chip. That, too, would fetch a decent price. At the right pawn shop, that night, in a small but clean hotel room. Paid for with the proceeds from my pawn jewelry, I began constructing a new identity from the ashes of the old. The woman who emerged had Eleanor's face, but none of her naive trust. This woman remembered every civic confidence Mark had shared across pillows, every casual remark about zoning changes, every vulnerability revealed during a lifetime of intimate access. This woman was dangerous precisely because she had been underestimated. As I drifted into exhausted sleep, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. Mark had made a catastrophic error. Not in betraying me, though. That would prove costly enough, but in reminding me of who I had been before him, the meticulous archivist who specialized in uncovering hidden patterns and structural weaknesses, the woman who understood how power and money really worked, the woman who now had nothing left to lose. The temporary ID felt flimsy in my hands. Nothing like the sturdy driver's license Mark had effectively confiscated, yet this temporary document represented something profound. My first step toward reclaiming independence. Your bus ticket to the state capitol departs tomorrow morning, the city hall officer explained, sliding a printout across the desk. The emergency assistance covers bus fare only. We'll need to repay it within 90 days. I nodded, scanning the details. 24 hours until I could leave the city. 24 hours to decide what happened next. I've also prepared this police report documenting the theft of your belongings, she continued. This should help with insurance claims once you're settled. Insurance claims, credit card cancellations, bank notifications, the mundane aftermath of catastrophe. Accepted the paperwork with a hollow feeling in my chest. These practical concerns felt disconnected from the real decision looming before me. What kind of life would I return to? Back in my modest hotel room, I spread the documents on the bed, creating a physical map of my options. The bus ticket, the police report, the receipt from the pawn shop where I'd sold my wedding ring. Each paper represented a different path. I could go home and rebuild from zero, find a small apartment, reactivate my long-dormant career as an archivist, file for divorce, and try to forget the last 40 years. The safe choice. The expected choice. Or I could do something else entirely. My old flip phone, which I'd secretly kept in my travel bag, and charged with a borrowed charger, pinged with a message from Margaret. Found the old file boxes. Everything's here. Original incorporation documents, old contracts, even your dad's old legal notes on property law. What exactly am I looking for? My fingers hovered over the keypad. This was the moment of decision. I could tell her to leave everything where it was, to forget this wild idea taking shape in my mind. Just help me find an apartment and a job interview instead. Or I could become the woman Mark never expected, the one who wouldn't just survive his betrayal, but make him regret it with every fiber of his being. Look for the original incorporation papers, I typed. The ones Dad insisted on filing before the wedding. The ones listing me as a founding partner with 25% ownership. Margaret's response came quickly. Found them. Fully. Eleanor, these were never superseded by later filings. According to this, you still own a quarter of Mark's original company. A strange calm settled over me as the pieces aligned. My father, a shrewd lawyer, had insisted I be included in the original corporate structure, a wedding gift. Mark had dismissed as sentimental nonsense, but never formally changed. After his father's death, Mark had simply removed me from operations, counting on my trust and lack of interest in the legal details. There's more, Margaret wrote. Robert Davies, your father-in-law's old friend, still controls 20% of the shares as the executor of the elder Vance's estate. Robert, Mark's father's old friend, who had tried to warn me about the suspicious financial activities. The man Mark had dismissed as senile when he raised concerns. Together, Robert's managed shares and my ownership would constitute a controlling interest in Mark's original company. My hands trembled as I dialed Robert's number from memory. Eleanor. His voice was cautious. Is everything all right? You're calling from an unknown number. No, Robert. Everything is not all right, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Mark abandoned me at the police station after I discovered evidence of embezzlement through company accounts. Silence stretched across the line. Then, I've been worried something like this might happen. The patterns I've been seeing, they're systematic, deliberate. How long do you think it's been going on? Since his father died, I suspect. Mark was brilliant, but always impatient. His father kept him ethical. After he passed, Robert sighed heavily. I should have pushed harder, asked more questions. It's not your fault, I assured him. But I need your help now. According to the original incorporation documents, I still own 25% of the company. And you control his father's shares as executor, correct? Yes. Until the terms of his long-term trust mature, another 10 years. Robert paused. Are you suggesting, Eleanor? I'm suggesting we save the company Mark's father built. Clean out the corruption. Remove Mark and anyone else involved in illegal activities. That's extraordinary and dangerous. These operations involving city funds, they don't happen without powerful, dangerous partners. I know. I thought of Mark's threat at the hotel, the cold calculation in his eyes. But I also know the alternative is watching his father's legacy become nothing more than a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Robert was silent for so long. Thought we'd lost connection. What do you need from me? He finally asked. The question crystallized everything. There would be no going back from this moment. No returning to the comfortable, ignorant life I'd led before. This choice would define everything that followed. I need you to call an emergency board. Meeting. As his father's executive, you have that right. Schedule it for 1 week from today. Mark will fight this. Let him. The steel in my voice surprised even me. Also, I need access to funds. Enough to get back on my feet and prepare. Mark controls all our joint accounts. You can arrange a loan against your shares. It will take a few days to process. I need it sooner. Tomorrow, if possible. I need to make some acquisitions before returning to the city. Acquisitions? I thought of the brownstone. The elegant home market insisted we buy in his name alone for tax purposes. The place where he'd kissed me goodbye before the gala, knowing he planned to abandon me. Evidence, I said simply, and leverage. After ending the call, I stepped onto the small balcony of my hotel room. The city's skyline glittered against the night, spectacular and familiar. 24 hours ago. This view had represented everything I'd achieved as Mark Vance's wife, access to a world of luxury and privilege few ever experienced. Now I saw it differently. Not as the pinnacle of success, but as the perfect symbol of illusion, gleaming towers rising, improbably from a foundation of corruption. Spectacular from a distance, but built by exploited connections. Fueled by money of questionable origin, designed to impress rather than endure, just like my marriage. I returned inside and reached for the hotel stationery. In careful handwriting, I began listing the steps needed for what came next. Not a plan for survival, a strategy for resurrection. By morning, I had filled 3 pages with notes. Names of board members who might support me. Financial institutions that had processed suspicious transactions. City council members whose contracts seemed legitimate versus those that appeared to be shells. A detailed timeline for my return to the city. When Robert's wire transfer arrived the following afternoon, a sum modest by Mark's standards. But more than enough for my immediate needs, I made one final decision. Instead of boarding my bus back to the city, I changed my destination. First, to the state capital, where Mark's company kept its corporate registrations and where I knew certain backup records were maintained. Then, to a neighboring state, where the banking connections would yield documentation I couldn't access otherwise. Mark expected me to run home, defeated, if he thought of me at all. Instead, I would arrive back in the city only when I was ready, armed with everything needed to take back what was rightfully mine and more. The safe choice would have been returning immediately to lick my wounds and start over. I chose war instead. The state capitol hit me with a wall of humid air. As I exited the bus terminal, the contrast with the city's slightly drier summer heat was jarring, like moving between different atmospheric pressures. I took a deep breath of the air, laden with unfamiliar scents, fragrant street food, exhaust from passing taxis, the subtle sweetness of magnolias that seemed to bloom everywhere in this meticulously maintained state capitol. I'd been to the Capitol once before, accompanying Mark to a statewide real estate conference years earlier. Then, I'd experienced the city through the protective bubble of luxury. 5-star hotels, private drivers, exclusive restaurants. Now I stood alone on the curb, watching travelers being greeted by loved ones, while I held nothing but a small duffel bag purchased at a local market containing a change of clothes and the few toiletries I could afford. My temporary ID earned a raised eyebrow from the motel clerk, but Robert's wire transfer gave me enough financial cushion to book a modest room in a quiet residential district, far from the gleaming state government buildings where Mark's influence was strongest. "First time in the Capitol?" the motel clerk asked as I checked in. "No," I replied, "but it feels like it." My room was clean but Spartan, a twin bed, a small desk. In a bathroom where the shower sprayed directly over the toilet, a far cry from the luxury I'd grown accustomed to. But it offered something more valuable than comfort, anonymity. I'd chosen the state capitol deliberately. During Mark's company's expansion, he had boasted about their data redundancy systems, backup servers maintained independently from their city headquarters. Even if headquarters burned to the ground, he'd told investors, we wouldn't lose a byte of client data. What Mark didn't know was how carefully I'd listened during those technical briefings, how I'd memorized the names of system administrators, the locations of server facilities, the protocols for emergency access. Information absorbed during years of being the attentive civic wife, present but presumed irrelevant. After a brief rest, I ventured out into the humid evening. The Capitol's efficient public transportation system was a blessing. Delivered me within 2 blocks of my first target, a nondescript office building housing one of Mark's discrete data centers. I studied the building from a coffee shop across the street, planning my approach. Security would be tight but focused on cyber threats, not physical ones. No one would expect the founder's wife to appear unannounced halfway across the state. The next morning, I put my plan into action. I'd spent the remains of my pawned jewelry money on appropriate attire. A conservative business suit and modest heels that transformed me back into Eleanor Vance's civic wife. My hair was pulled into a neat, low bun, makeup carefully applied. To project confidence and authority, at precisely 9:15 a.m., I walked through the lobby of the building, nodding confidently to security as if I belonged. Mark's corporate offices occupied the 5th floor, accessed by key-carded elevators. I approached the front desk with practiced charm. "Good morning, Eleanor Vance. To see Mr. Thomas here, please." The receptionist looked startled. "Mrs. Vance? We weren't expecting you." "It's an unscheduled visit. Mark wanted me to personally deliver some documents while I'm in the Capitol for a charity event." I smiled apologetically. I should have called ahead, but with the time difference. "Is Mr. Thomas available?" Thomas was the regional IT director, a brilliant systems architect who had always treated me with genuine respect during company events. More importantly, he'd been hired during my active involvement with the company and owed his rapid promotion partly to my recommendation. 5 minutes later, Thomas emerged into the reception area, surprise evident on his face. "Mrs. Vance, what an unexpected pleasure." "Thomas, how many times must I ask you to call me Eleanor?" I embraced him warmly, maintaining the fiction that this was a routine visit. "Do you have a moment? I need your expertise on something Mark is concerned about." In his private office, the facade dropped. Thomas's expression grew concerned as he noticed my lack of staff, security, or the usual trappings of the founders. "Wife, is everything all right, Mrs. Vance?" I made a split-second decision. Partial honesty might serve better than complete deception. No, Thomas. Everything is not all right. I need access to the Capital backup servers, and I need your absolute discretion. His eyes widened. That would require authorization from Mr. Vance or from a company owner. I finished for him. I'm both Mark's wife and a 25% owner of his original company, according to the original incorporation documents. I slid across a digital copy of the ownership papers Margaret had located. Thomas studied them carefully, his eye-tight-trained mind processing the implications.
Oh.
There are irregularities in some of the company's international transactions. Continued watching his reaction closely. Nothing that would compromise our client's data. Mark would never risk that. But concerning enough that I'm conducting a private audit before involving outside authorities? It wasn't entirely a lie. I was indeed conducting an audit of sorts. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tension in his shoulders. He knew something wasn't right with Mark's operations. Whether he knew the full extent of the embezzlement, I couldn't tell. The system will log any access, he said finally. I can't override that. I don't need you to. In fact, I want the access logged properly under my credentials. After a moment's consideration, Thomas nodded. I'll need to verify your identity through the system. Standard protocol. The next hour was a tense exercise in technical authentication. Thomas was thorough, professional, and just paranoid enough to be good at his job. When the final verification cleared, he moved to a specialized workstation. You'll have 6 hours of access to the archive systems. After that, the temporary credentials expire. The system will automatically flag unusual access patterns to senior management. 6 hours to find evidence of Mark's criminal operation within terabytes of corporate data. That would have been impossible for someone without my background. But I hadn't just been a civic wife these past 40 years. I'd been an observer, absorbing the patterns and structures of Mark's operations, waiting for a purpose I hadn't realized would come. Thank you, Thomas. I won't forget this. He gave me a long look. Whatever you find, Marks. Company employs good people here. People with families, responsibilities. I know this isn't about destroying the company. It's about saving it. As Thomas left me alone with the system, I felt a weight settle onto my shoulders. I was crossing a threshold into unknown territory. Not just accessing corporate data without Mark's knowledge, but committing to a path that would forever change the trajectory of my life. The familiar corporate interface glowed on the screen before me. Somewhere within those encrypted files lay the evidence I needed. Proof of Mark's crimes, documentation of the money flows, identification of his accomplices. With it, I could either destroy him or force a reckoning that might save the company his father had built. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. This was my last chance to turn back, to choose the simpler path of divorce and walking. Away the path of least resistance. Instead, I began to type. 6 hours later, I left the company offices with an encrypted drive containing everything I needed from the Capital servers. Thomas had maintained professional distance during my visit, but as I departed, he pressed a business card into my hand. My personal number, he murmured, if you need technical assistance that won't be logged in company systems. I'd underestimated him. Thomas hadn't just given me access. He'd made a choice to side with me over Mark. A small victory, but significant. The first ally in what would become a carefully assembled coalition. Back in my modest motel room, I reviewed what I'd discovered. The evidence was more damning than I'd anticipated. Elaborate schemes moving money through a dozen jurisdictions, fake contracts with shell companies, systematically falsified financial reports. Most disturbingly, correspondence that implicated not just Mark but Victor and Leonard, along with 3 other executives I'd considered friends. The company I'd helped build had been corrupted to its core. Saving it would require excising the infection entirely. That night, I booked a bus ticket to a neighboring state's banking hub. The state capital had given me the documentation I needed. This new destination would provide the banking connections and legal strategy required for what came next. With each step into this unfamiliar world of corporate espionage and financial investigation, I felt less like Mark Vance's abandoned wife and more like someone new. Emerging from that chrysalis, someone stronger, more dangerous, and utterly committed to justice. Someone Mark would soon wish he'd never betrayed. The banking hub embraced me with a quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to the capital's humid bustle and the city's ostentatious wealth. The city carried itself with quiet confidence, its money and power flowing discreetly behind modern glass facades and the understated discipline of financial precision. I checked into a small guest house in a modest district, far from the luxury hotels where Mark and I had stayed during previous visits. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Davis, raised an eyebrow at my minimal luggage, but asked no questions when I paid. For a week in advance, from Robert's wire transfer. "The room has a desk, if you are here for business," she informed me in a gentle voice, handing over a heavy brass key and very fast internet. "All my guests require it now." The room was Spartan but immaculate. Polished wood floors, crisp white linens, and tall windows overlooking a narrow, tree-lined street. I set up my temporary workstation on the antique desk, connecting the encrypted drive from the state capital to my newly purchased laptop. This new location represented the next crucial phase of my plan. While the state capital had provided the evidence of Mark's embezzlement operations, this banking hub held the key to understanding how those operations connected to the legitimate global banking system. More importantly, it was home to Margaret Evans, my steadfast friend from law school, who had left the city years earlier to establish her own law firm specializing in financial crime and white-collar defense. She'd invited me to join her team. At the time, an opportunity I declined under pressure from Mark, who had insisted my place was by his side rather than building my own career. "You don't need to work, Eleanor," he'd argued. "We have more money than we could spend in 3 lifetimes." I'd capitulated then, prioritizing marital harmony over professional fulfillment. The memory of that surrender now fueled my determination as I navigated the city's elegant streets toward Margaret's offices near the HEC Financial District. The receptionist's eyes widened when I gave my name. "Mrs. Vance, do you have an appointment?" "No," I admitted, "but please tell Miss Evans that Eleanor Reeves is here, her former colleague from New York." Minutes later, Margaret herself strode into the reception area, tall, imposing, and elegantly attired in a sharp pantsuit that radiated authority. Her silver-streaked hair was still cut in the same no-nonsense bob I remembered. At 66, she remained a formidable presence in the legal community. Her professional smile faltered when she registered my appearance. The modest, off-the-rack clothes, the visible exhaustion, the lack of the polished luxury that had defined me as Mark Vance's wife. "Eleanor." Concern replaced her corporate warmth. "What's happened?" I maintained composure until her office door closed behind us. Then, facing the woman who had once believed in my professional potential, I finally allowed my carefully constructed facade to crack. "Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie," I said simply, "and I need your help to set it right." Over the next 2 hours, I laid out the situation with clinical precision. Mark's abandonment, the discovery of his company's embezzlement operations, my evidence from the state capitol, and my legal standing as an original company owner. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing progressively grimmer. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath her chin in the characteristic pose I remembered from our law school study sessions. "You understand what you're proposing," she said finally. "Taking on your husband and his partners, exposing financial crimes that likely involve powerful city officials, restructuring a major development company, all while they believe you're defeated and helpless? Yes, it's extraordinarily dangerous. Kinds of operations don't exist in isolation. There will be interests beyond Mark's company who very much want their financial channels to remain operational. I know the risks, do you?" Her gaze was penetrating. "Mark abandoned you at a police station with nothing. What do you imagine he'd do if he knew you were gathering evidence against him?" The threat Mark had whispered in my ear at the hotel returned with chilling clarity. "I'll make sure you disappear. Nobody would ever find you." "That's precisely why I need your help," I replied. "It's not just your expertise in financial law, but your network, your protection." Margaret studied me for another long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. The same approving expression I remembered from our law school days, when I'd made a particularly insightful analysis. The quiet archivist I mentored has become something far more interesting. She pressed a button on her desk intercom. "Sarah, please clear my schedule for the remainder of the day and contact our forensic, accounting team, and our digital forensics expert. We'll need the secure conference room for the afternoon." By evening, I had been introduced to Margaret's core team, Sarah Chen, a formidable attorney specializing in financial crime, Daniel Miller, a brilliant digital forensics expert, and Robert Green, Margaret's unflappable chief of operations. Together, we spread my state capital evidence across the conference table, constructing a complex map of Mark's illicit operations. "The structure is sophisticated," Daniel observed, manipulating the digital records I'd extracted. "Multiple layers of shell companies, transfers timed to avoid regulatory flagging. Documentation that appears legitimate under casual inspection." Mark was always brilliant, I acknowledged, just not as brilliant as he thought. "Weak point is here," Sarah noted, indicating a series of transactions through a local nonprofit foundation. "They've been using the same pattern repeatedly. It creates a vulnerability. Can we use it to track the money flows backward?" I asked. "Better," Margaret interjected. "We can use it to document the entire network. Not just Mark's role, but everyone involved. City officials, intermediaries, facilitators." "That's not public information," I said cautiously. "Gaining access would require resources that Margaret's firm has," Margaret completed my thought. "We contract with regulatory bodies worldwide. Officially, we help banks comply with anti-money laundering regulations. Unofficially, we sometimes assist in building cases against significant financial crimes. Would you do that for me? Put company resources behind this?" Margaret's expression turned serious. "Not for you, Eleanor. For justice, and not without conditions. Name them. First, everything must be done legally. We document. We analyze, we prepare, but we don't hack, steal, or break laws." I nodded. "Agreed." "Second, you must be prepared to surrender all evidence to regulatory authorities when the time comes. No selective disclosure to protect anyone you might still have feelings for." "I have no loyalty left for anyone involved in this," I assured her. "Not even Mark." "And third," Margaret concluded, "you must promise me that when this is over, when you've reclaimed your company and your life, you will finally take the career path you abandoned. The public service community needs minds like yours, Eleanor. It always has." The third condition struck me unexpectedly. After a lifetime of having my professional abilities dismissed and diminished, Margaret's continued faith in my capabilities brought a lump to my throat. "I promise," I said softly. "Then consider my firm your ally." She extended her hand across the table, and we shook with the formality of a contract signing. "We begin tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp." As I walked back to my guest house through the city's twilight streets, I felt a profound shift in my circumstances. I was no longer alone in my quest for justice. For the first time since Mark's betrayal, I had allies, people who valued not just what I knew about Mark's operations, but who I was as a professional and a person. The path ahead remained treacherous, but I no longer had to walk it in isolation. With Margaret's team behind me, I could transform from victim to victor, not just reclaiming what was rightfully mine, but bringing to justice everyone who had participated in corrupting Mark's father's legacy. In abandoning me, Mark had unknowingly set in motion his own undoing. He'd expected me to remain the dependent wife he'd cultivated over a lifetime of subtle manipulation. Instead, he'd created his most dangerous adversary. For 2 weeks, I lived in a world of financial forensics and strategic planning within Margaret's firm's headquarters. Days began at dawn and stretched well into the night. My mind, once again, alive with the analytical challenges I'd abandoned for a lifetime of civic duties, buzzed with purpose. "You've lost none of your edge," Margaret remarked on our 5th consecutive 14-hour day. "If anything, you've gained perspective that makes your analysis more insightful." My temporary workstation in Margaret's secure room had become a war room of sorts. Digital screens displayed complex financial flows. Whiteboards mapped Mark's corporate structure with red markers highlighting vulnerabilities. A timeline tracked Mark's gradual transformation of the company from his father's legitimate business into a sophisticated embezzlement operation. The pattern began 3 months after his father's death, I explained to the team, pointing to the first suspicious transactions. Mark waited just long enough to consolidate control, then began with small test operations through the Capitol office. Classic approach, Daniel agreed, manipulating the digital display to highlight the pattern. Start small, ensure that channels work, then gradually increase volume once confidence builds. The work was exhausting, but exhilarating. For the first time since Mark's betrayal, I felt fully engaged with my own capabilities. Rather than drowning in emotional aftermath, each discovery, each connection mapped between shell companies and legitimate operations brought me closer to not just understanding what Mark had built, but how to dismantle it. On day 9, the first significant challenge emerged. Sarah rushed into our conference room, her typically composed demeanor visibly disturbed. "There's been a security breach at your guest house," she announced without preamble. "Someone accessed your room while you were here." Blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "We've had discreet surveillance on your guest house since you engaged our services," Robert explained calmly. "Standard protocol for high-risk clients." The implications were chilling. Either Mark had somehow tracked me to this city, or someone connected to his illicit operations had identified me as a threat. "Did they take anything?" I asked, mentally cataloging the few possessions in my room. "Nothing appears missing," Sarah replied. "But your laptop was accessed." The surveillance team observed a man in maintenance uniform entering with a key, spending approximately 12 minutes inside, then departing. Daniel immediately took my backup drive to his forensics lab. Within hours, he confirmed the worst. "They installed sophisticated tracking software," he reported grimly. "Had you connected to any of Mark's systems after returning to your room, it would have mapped your activities and reported back to whoever placed it. Can you trace who's behind it? The programming signature suggests commercially developed spyware, the kind Mark occasionally deploys for corporate clients. But attribution is difficult. Intrusion forced us to accelerate our timeline. I could no longer stay here safely, and any further research needed higher security protocols. We moved to Phase 2 immediately, Margaret decided. Robert, arrange secure transport back to the city. Daniel, sanitize all our systems of references to Eleanor's presence here. Back to the city? I questioned. Why not wait? Because, Margaret explained patiently, we need to establish your legal position before Mark realizes what you're doing. The city is home to the ultimate legal team that specializes in corporate governance issues across local jurisdictions. Within hours, I was on a private charter back to the city, arranged through Margaret's security protocols, leaving no commercial travel record. My few possessions remained in the guest house as a decoy. Daniel had cleansed my devices and provided a new secure laptop with advanced encryption. The familiar city rain greeted me at a private airfield outside the city, where a nondescript car waited to transport me to a secure apartment in a brownstone, maintained by Margaret's firm for high-profile clients. "Welcome to your new command center, ma'am," my driver announced as we entered an elegant townhouse. "The team is already assembled upstairs, in the apartment's dining room, converted to a conference space. I met the next group of allies in my campaign, barristers specializing in municipal corporate law, forensic accountants who had previously worked for regulatory agencies, and a distinguished, silver-haired gentleman introduced simply as Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell advises several regulatory bodies on complex financial crimes, Margaret explained. His involvement must remain strictly confidential. The gravitas with which she made this introduction suggested Mr. Caldwell was far more influential than his understated appearance would indicate. "Mrs. Vance," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "your evidence against Mark's company's operations is compelling. However, moving against an organization of this sophistication requires precise choreography." "I understand," I replied, "but time is against us." "Someone already knows I'm gathering evidence." "All the more reason to proceed methodically," he countered. "A miscalculation now could not only undermine your legal position, but potentially put you in physical danger. Over the next 3 days, we constructed what Mr. Caldwell called the architecture of reclamation, a multi-pronged strategy combining corporate governance, regulatory intervention, and strategic leverage. The first test of this strategy came unexpectedly on day 3 in the city. My secure phone, a device only 5 people had the number 4, rang at 2:17 a.m. Eleanor. Thomas from the Capitol, came the urgent voice when I answered. You need to know. Security teams conducted a raid on my department today. They seized servers and questioned everyone about unauthorized access. My stomach dropped. Were you implicated? Not directly. I covered our tracks well. But Mark himself is in the Capitol now, leading the investigation. He knows someone accessed the backup systems. What about your safety, Thomas? I've already tendered my resignation, citing family reasons. By the time they realize I helped you, I'll be back with my parents. His voice lowered. But there's more. They're watching all your known associates. Your friend Margaret reported someone following her in the city. The news sent ice through my veins. Involving Margaret had been my first move. Necessary, but now clearly dangerous for her. Tell me she's safe. She is. Robert Davies arranged private security for her 2 days ago. But Mark is systematically investigating everyone connected to you. It's only a matter of time before he traces your movements. After relaying this information to Margaret, our timeline compressed further. The emergency board meeting Robert Davies had called was only 4 days away, and Mark now knew someone was moving against him. We need to be at City Hall immediately, I insisted. Mr. Caldwell disagreed. Arriving just before the meeting maximizes tactical advantage. Mark will have minimal time to counter your evidence or prepare legal obstacles. The debate continued until Margaret intervened. Both perspectives have merit, she observed, which is why we implement a split strategy. Caldwell's team continues the legal groundwork here while you return to City Hall. Not openly, but through channels Mark won't monitor. What channels? I asked. Margaret's smile held a hint of satisfaction.
The very networks you've been
mapping. The weak points in Mark's operation aren't just vulnerabilities. They're access routes. We'll move you through their blind spots. The irony was perfect. I would return to City Hall using the same hidden pathways Mark had created for moving illicit funds channels designed to be invisible to normal monitoring systems, including his own. 24 hours later, I boarded a cargo flight to a nearby state as an administrative assistant to a local arts consultant, complete with appropriate documentation courtesy of Margaret's firm's resources. From there, I would cross back into the city by land, a method Mark's security monitoring would never anticipate for someone of my previous status. As the cargo plane rumbled into the night sky, I reviewed the encrypted files containing everything I'd need for the coming confrontation. The evidence was irrefutable, the legal strategy sound. The regulatory authorities quietly alerted. In just 3 days, I would face Mark across the boardroom to Bula, meeting he didn't yet know I would attend. The wife he'd abandoned at the police station with nothing would return as his company's potential destroyer or savior, depending entirely on his response to my terms. The turbulence of the cargo plane seemed fitting, a physical manifestation of the disruption I was about to unleash. The first true test of my transformation from civic wife to corporate avenger was about to begin. Mark had taught me an unintended lesson. Sometimes you have to lose everything to remember who you truly are. Now I would teach him one in return. Never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. New York City appeared through the taxi window like a dream from another life. It's familiar, yet strangely distant. 3 weeks had passed since Mark abandoned me at the police station, though it felt like years. The sleek glass towers of Manhattan no longer impressed me with their grandeur. I now saw them as I saw the opulent hotel, beautiful facades potentially concealing ugly truths. We crossed the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn, the city's skyline gilded by early morning light. My driver, arranged through Margaret's firm's network, maintained professional silence as he navigated toward Brooklyn Heights. My temporary residence wasn't the elegant brownstone Mark and I had shared, but a modest apartment belonging to a firm associate currently working overseas. "We're here, ma'am," the driver announced, pulling up to an unassuming building on a tree-lined street. As instructed, no one knows you've returned to the city except the core team. I thanked him and carried my single suitcase. Up the steps. The apartment was small but comfortable. Functional furniture, a well-stocked kitchen, and most importantly, a secure fiber connection already configured to Margaret's firm's encrypted network. Within minutes of arrival, I established my command center on the dining room table, connecting with Margaret's team. Position established, I confirmed through our secure channel. What's our status? Robert Davies has confirmed the board meeting remains scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m., Margaret replied. Mark returned from the capital yesterday and has been in closed-door meetings with Victor and Leonard since his arrival. He suspects something significant, undoubtedly, but he can't know the full extent. Our sources indicate he believes this is about the server breach, not a comprehensive move against his leadership. I spent the day reviewing our strategy one final time, preparing for every possible countermove Mark might attempt. The evidence was organized, the legal structures verified, the regulatory notifications in place. Yet anxiety gnawed at me, not fear of failure, but the surreal nature of confronting the man who had been my husband, partner, and ultimately betrayer. That evening, standing before the bathroom mirror, I confronted my reflection with clear eyes. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the polished civic wife who had been left at the police station weeks earlier. My hair, once maintained with expensive treatments, now hung in a simple, practical cut I'd received in the new state. The elegant clothes had been replaced with a streamlined wardrobe chosen for function rather than status. Even my posture had changed. Shoulders straighter, chin higher, eyes sharper. The external transformation reflected a deeper internal shift. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, decorative accessory to Mark's success. I had reclaimed Eleanor Reeves, the archivist with a gift for uncovering hidden patterns and structural weaknesses. More than that, I'd become someone new, entirely a hybrid creature forged in betrayal and tempered through strategic response. The night before the confrontation, performed one final ritual of transformation. From my suitcase, I removed the last physical connection to my old identity. My old driver's license issued in the name Eleanor Vance, while my temporary ID had been necessary for travel. I'd applied for an expedited replacement under my original legal name, Eleanor Reeves Vance. This hyphenated version had been my legal name since marriage, though Mark had discouraged its use, claiming it was cumbersome for social occasions. Now, I understood his subtle erasure for what it was. Another method of removing my independent identity. I placed both documents side by side on the kitchen counter. The difference was symbolic but profound. Tomorrow, I would enter Mark's headquarters. Not as his discarded wife, but as an original founder with legal standing and irrefutable evidence of corporate crimes. Sleep eluded me that night. Instead, I rehearsed scenarios, anticipated Mark's likely tactics, and reviewed the evidence one final time. By morning, I was exhausted but resolute, my mind sharp with purpose as I dressed in a charcoal gray suit purchased in the new state. Professional, understated, and utterly unlike the designer labels Mark had insisted I wear. Remember, Margaret had advised during our final briefing, your greatest advantage is his underestimation of you. He abandoned you because he believed you were powerless without him. That belief is his vulnerability. At precisely 1:15 p.m., I arrived at an unremarkable coffee shop 3 blocks from Mark's headquarters in Midtown. Robert Davies was already waiting, his distinguished appearance somehow both conspicuous and forgettable in the busy cafe. Eleanor, he greeted me with gentle formality, rising as I approached. You look remarkably well, considering the circumstances. Circumstances have a way of revealing what matters, I replied, accepting his offered handshake. Is everything prepared? Robert nodded, sliding a leather portfolio across the table. The board is assembled. Mark has been unusually tense, demanding complete loyalty pledges from executives, investigating security breaches. He knows something is happening, but can't identify the threat. The documents, all verified. His father's shares, combined with your ownership, constitute controlling interest. Robert's expression softened. His father would be proud of what you're doing. He always said Mark needed balance, someone to temper his brilliance with ethics. He thought that person was you. Mention of my late father-in-law brought unexpected emotion. How Robert had welcomed me into the Vance family with genuine warmth, treating me as an intellectual equal rather than merely his son's wife. His inclusion of my name on the founding documents hadn't been merely sentimental. It had been prescient. "It's time," Robert said, checking his watch. "The car is waiting." The sleek black town car delivered us to Mark's headquarters. A 20-story glass tower in Midtown with the company's distinctive logo emblazoned across the entrance. Security guards recognized Robert immediately, but looked at me with confusion. "Mrs. Vance?" one asked hesitantly. "We weren't informed you would be visiting today?" "Ms. Reeves Vance," I corrected gently. "I'm here for the board meeting." Their uncertainty was palpable as they consulted their tablets. Robert intervened smoothly. "Ms. Reeves Vance is an original company founder and board member," he explained, presenting documentation. "Her clearance is perpetual under Article 7 of the corporate charter. After a brief, tense verification, we were allowed through security." As we rode the elevator to the executive floor, Robert squeezed my hand briefly. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "you've already won by taking back your power." The boardroom doors loomed before us, heavy mahogany panels that had always represented the inner sanctum of Mark's dominion. Beyond them waited not just Mark, but the culmination of my transformation. The security guard stationed outside recognized Robert and nodded respectfully, then looked at me with that same confusion I'd encountered downstairs. "It's all right, Thomas," Robert said. "Ms. Reeves Vance has full board clearance." Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward as the guard opened the door. The conversation inside ceased abruptly as I entered. 8 people sat around. The massive conference table company executives, legal counsel, and at the head, Mark himself. His expression shifted from irritation at the interruption to utter shock as he recognized me. For a single, satisfying moment, the polished entrepreneur was rendered completely speechless, his composure shattered by my impossible presence. "Hello, Mark," I said, my voice steady and clear in the stunned silence. "I believe this meeting concerns the future of your company. As a founding owner with 25% equity stake, I'll be participating in those discussions." I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, placing my portfolio precisely before me. The woman who had been abandoned at the police station with nothing now sat as an equal, no, a superior to the man who had discarded her. "Now," I continued into the shocked silence, "shall we begin?" The boardroom remained frozen in shock. Mark recovered first, his initial surprise transforming into calculated charm. The same facade he'd deployed throughout our marriage whenever faced with unexpected challenges. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, rising from his chair,
"This
is certainly a surprise. We were all concerned after that unfortunate situation at the gala. I'm relieved to see you've made it home safely." "Spare me the performance, Mark," I replied, my voice steady. "We both know exactly what happened at the gala. The question is whether everyone else at this table understands what's been happening with your company under your leadership." I opened my portfolio, removing the first document, a comprehensive analysis of Mark's embezzlement operations, and slid it to Robert Davies, who began distributing copies around the table. Mark's feigned composure fractured as he glimpsed the contents. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced sharply. "We have a private family matter to discuss." "On the contrary," Robert interjected, "this meeting was called specifically to address governance concerns. As the executive of his father's estate and representative of his 20% ownership stake, I insist we proceed." The next hour transformed the room's dynamics completely. As evidence was presented, alliances shifted visibly. Several board members, particularly those who had known Mark's father, moved physically away from Mark's end of the table. Victor and Leonard remained loyally at his side, their faces hardening as their complicity was exposed. "These allegations are absurd," Victor declared. "This is clearly an attempt by Mrs. Vance to extract revenge for personal grievances." "Ms. Reeves Vance," I corrected him firmly. "The state capitol server logs, confirming your direct involvement, suggest otherwise, Victor." By meeting end, the board had split into clear factions. those aligned with Mark and his co-conspirators, those supporting my effort to reclaim and rehabilitate the company, and those cautiously neutral, awaiting the outcome before committing. Mark cornered me as the room emptied, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what you've started, Eleanor. There are people involved in these operations who won't hesitate to make me disappear. I finished for him, like you threatened at the hotel. You should know that complete documentation of your company's operations has been secured with multiple legal entities. Anything happens to me, it all becomes public immediately." For the first time, I saw genuine fear in Mark's eyes. Not for me, but for himself. He had never truly seen me until this moment, never recognized the strength and intelligence he'd systematically undermined for years. As I left Mark's headquarters that afternoon, I wasn't just walking away from a successful board confrontation. I was walking toward a new community of allies committed to restoring his father's legacy. Robert Davies, Margaret's team, Thomas from the state capitol, board members who had voted to suspend Mark pending investigation, and most importantly, my own reclaimed identity as Eleanor Vance, corporate strategist and reformer. My transformation was no longer just personal. It had become the nucleus of a movement to reclaim the company itself. The victory at the board meeting proved to be just the beginning of a brutal struggle for the company's future. Within 48 hours of Mark's suspension, the real counterattack began. Not through corporate channels, but through more personal and devastating means. I was reviewing forensic accounting reports in my Brooklyn Heights apartment when the call came from Margaret. "Someone broke into my house," she said, voice trembling. "They didn't take anything valuable, just my laptop and the file box you asked me to secure." Hours later, Robert Davies reported similar intrusions at his home office. The pattern was clear. Mark was systematically eliminating copies of the evidence against him, while the security team I'd hired through Margaret's firm reported increasing surveillance of my movements. The most devastating blow came 3 days after the board meeting. Margaret called from her office, her typically composed voice tight with concern. "Daniel has been arrested," she reported. "Local authorities are charging him with cybercrime violations related to the state capitol server access. His bail has been denied." The message was unmistakable. Mark might be suspended from company operations, but his international connections remained powerful. He was demonstrating that anyone who helped me would face consequences. That night, alone, in my borrowed apartment, doubt crept in for the first time since being abandoned. The confidence that had carried me through the state capitol and the banking hub wavered as I confronted the collateral damage my quest for justice was creating. Daniel's freedom, Margaret's safety, Robert's reputation all were now compromised because they had allied themselves with me. "Perhaps you should consider a settlement," Robert suggested gently during our emergency meeting the following morning. "Mark has offered to resign quietly with generous compensation if you drop all investigations and evidence." The old Eleanor might have accepted this compromise, the path of least resistance, avoiding further conflict. But the woman I had become recognized the manipulation behind the offer. "If we stop now, everyone who helped me remains vulnerable," I replied, my resolve hardening rather than weakening under pressure. "Daniel stays in prison. The embezzlement continues under new management, and Mark escapes accountability completely." That night marked my darkest moment, but also the turning point. Instead of retreating, I decided to accelerate. If Mark wanted war, I would give him total warfare, deploying every resource and connection I'd established. By dawn, I had developed a new strategy that would transform this personal battle into something Mark couldn't fight alone, something bigger than both of us, something that would not just reclaim his father's company but fundamentally reform it. The company his father had built would not merely survive this crisis. It would emerge transformed, with me at its helm, not as Mark's replacement, but as something entirely new. The third morning after the board confrontation, an unexpected message arrived from a ghost of my former life. My secure phone, the number known only to my closest allies, displayed a Manhattan area code I didn't recognize. "Ms. Vance?" A formal voice greeted me. "This is Leonard Thompson from Mark's company. I'd like to meet privately, to discuss matters of mutual interest." Leonard, Mark's loyal legal counsel and accomplice at the gala, the man who had helped orchestrate my abandonment, now sought a private meeting. Every instinct warned of a trap, yet strategic curiosity prevailed. "Why would I agree to that?" I asked coolly. "Because I have information about Mark's contingency plans that you need to hear, and because I've realized I'm on the wrong side of history in this conflict." We arranged to meet at the New York Public Library, public enough for safety, quiet enough for discretion. I arrived with two of Margaret's firm's security personnel positioned nearby. Taking no chances with Leonard's sudden change of heart, he looked diminished somehow, his once impeccable appearance now showing signs of strain, wrinkled shirt, shadowed eyes, nervous gestures. When he spotted me, his expression registered something I'd never seen from him before: respect. "You for coming," he began, sliding a flash drive across the table. "This contains Mark's personal files on what he calls Operation Cleanup. It details how he plans to disappear with approximately $25 million in company funds, while leaving you and Robert to face the regulatory investigations. Why are you giving me this?" I studied his face for deception. "Because Mark made the same mistake with me that he made with you," Eleanor Leonard replied, a bitter edge to his voice. "He assumed complete loyalty while planning to sacrifice me if necessary. The execution orders for cleanup include eliminating all witnesses, including me." The flash drive contained exactly what Leonard had promised: evidence that Mark was preparing to flee the country with embezzled assets, while deploying elaborate legal mechanisms to implicate others in his schemes. Most valuable was proof that Mark had secretly purchased a controlling interest in the brownstone we had shared, the home I'd believed was in his name for tax purposes. Documents revealed he had used company funds, disguised through shell companies, to pay for what was legally marital property. "He never intended to share anything with you," Leonard explained. "The prenuptial agreement you signed contained clauses that would be triggered if he ever faced legal scrutiny. The brownstone, the art collection, even your jewelry, all would be protected as company assets, not personal property." Leonard's betrayal of Mark wasn't driven by newfound ethics, but by self-preservation. Yet his defection represented something significant: the beginning of Mark's empire collapsing from within. "What do you want in exchange?" I asked directly. "Immunity from prosecution, a clean exit," and he hesitated. "Acknowledgement that I helped stop something that grew far beyond what any of us originally intended." As Leonard left, I realized this message from my past wasn't just about evidence or strategy. It was confirmation that the world I'd inhabited as Mark Vance's wife had been entirely illusory. A carefully constructed facade where nothing, not even our home, had truly belonged to me. The revelation didn't bring pain as it once might have. Instead, it crystallized my resolve to build something authentic from the ashes of Mark's deception. Final confrontation with Mark unfolded not in a corporate boardroom, but in the brownstone we had once shared, the elegant residence I had decorated with painstaking care during happier times. Believing it represented our shared success, I arrived precisely at noon, entering with the key I still possessed. The security staff, confused by recent events but aware of my ownership claims, allowed me passage after verifying my identification.
Oh.
The silence of the familiar rooms heightened my awareness of the profound shift about to occur. The brownstone looked exactly as I remembered: original hardwood floors, custom furnishings, the expansive windows showcasing Manhattan's skyline. Only one element had changed. Mark stood by. The floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection fragmented across the glass, much like his crumbling empire. "Breaking and entering now, Eleanor?" he asked without turning, attempting nonchalance, though tension radiated from his posture. "One cannot break into what one legally owns," I replied, placing the property documents Leonard had provided on the antique desk. The brownstone purchase was completed with marital assets funneled through company accounts. It makes it joint property, regardless of whose name appears on the deed. Mark turned finally, his practiced charm nowhere in evidence. Instead, raw fury and fear battled across his features. The mask of successful entrepreneur completely fallen away. "You've systematically destroyed everything I built," he said, voice dangerously low. "Correction, everything we built?" I countered calmly. And you destroyed it yourself when you turned your father's legitimate company into an embezzlement operation. For nearly an hour, we circled each other verbally, Mark alternating between threats, attempting to re-establish psychological control, and eventually desperate bargaining. We could still salvage something, he offered, a shadow of his former confidence. I have offshore resources even your forensic team hasn't discovered. We could disappear, start over somewhere new. The suggestion was almost laughable. This man who had abandoned me penniless at a police station now proposed we flee together. Not from love or loyalty, but because I had proven more valuable as an ally than an enemy. I'm not here to negotiate, Mark. I'm here to inform you of decisions already made. I removed the final document from my portfolio, the comprehensive settlement that Margaret's legal team had prepared. You have two options. Sign this agreement, transferring all your company shares to me, and cooperating fully with authorities in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Or face prosecution without any protections whatsoever. Mark scanned the document, his expression shifting from disbelief to comprehension of his complete defeat. You planned this from the moment I left you, he said. Not a question, but a realization. No, Mark. You planned this the moment you decided. I was dispensable. I placed a pen beside the document. The difference is, I executed my response better than you predicted. His signature, when it finally came, was a broken version of the confident flourish I'd watched on countless documents throughout our marriage. With that single stroke, ownership of his father's company and the brownstone we stood in transferred completely to me as he gathered the few personal items the agreement permitted him to take. Mark paused at the door for one final attempt to reassert control. You won't succeed, he said simply. The business relationships that made this company valuable require compromises you're not prepared to make. I met his gaze steadily. That was always your fundamental misunderstanding, Mark. You saw this company as valuable despite its corruption. I see it as valuable because of what it can become once that corruption is removed. When the door closed behind him, I stood alone in the brownstone that now legally belonged solely to me. The view remained spectacular, the furnishings still luxurious. But the space felt different, cleansed of a presence that had gradually poisoned everything it touched. Tomorrow would bring the challenges of rebuilding the company, of transforming a compromised entity into something worthy of his father's original vision. But today, in this moment, I allowed myself to fully absorb what had been accomplished. The woman abandoned at the police station with nothing now stood victorious, having reclaimed not just material assets, but something far more valuable. Her own power. The transformation of Mark Vance's company began the morning after his departure. The building that had once represented his singular vision now hummed with a different energy as I walked through the lobby, nodding to security staff who regarded me with newfound respect. Good morning, Ms. Reeves Vance, the receptionist greeted me, the name change already implemented throughout company systems. Robert Davies waited in what had been Mark's office, now temporarily mine, until the renovation plans were completed. The space still carried too many reminders of its previous occupant: dark woods, masculine leather, and imposing art selected to intimidate rather than inspire. The regulatory officials will arrive at 10, Robert informed me, placing a stack of documents on the desk. They're impressed with our proactive cooperation. The prosecutor believes we can salvage the company's reputation if we continue this transparent approach. In Daniel's situation, I asked, the wrongful imprisonment of Margaret's digital forensics expert remained my most urgent concern. State authorities received our documentation this morning. His release is being processed as we speak. Robert smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Margaret sends her congratulations, by the way. She's arriving next week to discuss implementing comprehensive compliance systems. The following weeks blurred into a carefully orchestrated dance of legal negotiations, corporate restructuring, and public relations management, with Leonard's cooperation as a key witness. Authorities were able to isolate the criminal elements within Mark's operations while preserving its legitimate development business. Mark and Victor faced multiple federal charges. Lower-level employees involved in the embezzlement were offered varying degrees of leniency in exchange for cooperation. 3 months after the confrontation, I stood in the newly redesigned Headquarters, watching workers install the rebranded company logo. No longer Vance Developments, the firm now operated as Reeves Integrity Group, a name, simultaneously honoring my reclaimed identity and signaling our new operational philosophy. The brownstone underwent a similar transformation. I donated most of the furnishings Mark had selected, replacing them with pieces that reflected my own aesthetic rather than the ostentatious luxury he had preferred. The space that had once felt like a gilded cage became a sanctuary. My own domain rather than an extension of someone else's ego. On the anniversary of my abandonment at the police station, I hosted a small gathering at my home. Margaret flew in from her office, Robert brought his wife, and even Thomas made the journey from the state capitol, where he now headed my company's data security division. As we shared a meal around my dining table, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as Mark Vance's wife had disappeared completely, replaced by someone I was still getting to know, a leader, strategist, reformer who had not only survived betrayal but transformed it into unprecedented growth. A toast, Robert proposed, raising his glass. To Eleanor, who reminded us all that true security comes not from wealth or power, but from knowing exactly who you are. As our glasses clinked together, I felt the final pieces of my new identity lock into place. The past no longer defined me. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I was only beginning to explore. Then came the unexpected phone call. It was a formal request from the city's leading civic organizations, backed by influential community leaders. They wanted me to consider running for mayor. The current administration was mired in scandals, many of them connected to the very corruption I had exposed. My story of personal betrayal, of reclaiming integrity, of fighting for justice, had resonated deeply with the public. I had initially dismissed the idea. Expertise was in corporate structure, not public office. But as I thought about all the people Mark had exploited, all the public trust he had eroded, I realized the power I now held could extend beyond a single company. It could be used to truly serve the city. I ran a grassroots campaign focusing on transparency, accountability, and rebuilding community trust. My past, once a source of humiliation, became my strength. The narrative of my husband left me at the police station his face when the chief introduced me as the new mayor. Spread like wildfire. Voters saw in me not a polished politician, but a survivor. A woman who understood what it felt like to be betrayed by those in power. My allies from the corporate battle became my campaign team. Margaret managing legal affairs, Robert advising on ethics, Thomas heading data security for my campaign, ensuring no digital vulnerabilities. Leonard, seeking true redemption, became a valuable, though discreet, source of information on the city's corrupt underbelly. Election night was a blur of cheering crowds and flashing cameras. When the final results were announced, a wave of disbelief, then profound gratitude washed over me. I, Eleanor Reeves Vance, was the new mayor. The day of my inauguration dawned crisp and clear, symbol of the fresh start I hoped to bring to the city. I dressed carefully in a simple, elegant suit, chosen for its practicality and its reflection of my new identity. The old designer labels, the ostentatious jewelry, they were a distant memory, left behind with the gilded cage of my past life. My family and closest friends gathered around me, my children, David and Sarah, beaming with pride. Margaret, her eyes shining with quiet triumph. Robert Davies, his face etched with satisfaction at seeing his old friend's legacy truly honored. The inauguration ceremony was held on the steps of City Hall, the very building where, less than a year ago, I had sat on a hard bench, abandoned and alone. The crowd was enormous, a sea of faces eager for change. The roar of applause as I walked to the podium was deafening, a stark contrast to the silence that had surrounded me in the precinct. The oath of office felt weighty, each word a promise to the citizens I now served, and then it happened. Moment of poetic justice. As the ceremony concluded, the chief of police, a man who had only recently been a grim-faced figure overseeing my processing, stepped forward to offer his congratulations. He stood beside me, facing the jubilant crowd, and raised his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming across the plaza. "It is my distinct honor to introduce you to our new mayor, Eleanor Vance." From the corner of my eye, I saw him. Mark. He stood near the back of the crowd, amidst a cluster of reporters. He looked older, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. He had just been released on bail, awaiting his trial, and had clearly come to witness the spectacle of the new mayor's inauguration, perhaps hoping for a glimpse of his former life. His jaw dropped. His eyes widened, a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock passing over his features. The smug mask he'd worn at the police station was completely gone, replaced by utter disbelief. He froze, his composure shattering right there in the open for anyone who cared to see his face. It was priceless. The man who had left me stranded, believing I was powerless, now watched as the chief of police, the very authority figure who had once escorted me to an interrogation room, introduced me as the most powerful person in the city. The gavel I now metaphorically wielded wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a hammer ready to bring down the law on those who thought they were above it. The irony wasn't lost on me, or on him. I met his gaze across the crowd, a small, knowing smile touching my lips. There was no anger now, only a profound sense of closure. He had tried to destroy me, but in doing so, he had forged me into something stronger, something he could never control or diminish. He had left me with nothing, but in that nothing, I had found everything. My voice, clear and strong, carried across the plaza as I began my first speech as mayor. "Today," I said, looking out at the faces of my constituents, "we begin a new chapter for our city, a chapter built on integrity, on accountability, and on the unwavering belief that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." The past no longer defined me. It had merely been the crucible in which my true self was forged. The future stretched ahead, filled with the immense challenges and profound responsibilities of leading a city. But I faced it not as Mark Vance's abandoned wife, but as Mayor Eleanor Vance, a woman who had risen from the ashes of betrayal to reclaim not just her life, but her purpose, and to serve a community that had given her a second chance. And that, ultimately, was the most valuable ownership of all. Up next, we've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.